Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to attend the Chinese Politics and Economic Research Seminar by Georgetown University. My name is Li Liu. I am an assistant professor at the McDonald School of Business, and I co-organized this seminar series with Professor Ning Leng from the McCourt School of Public Policy. We also want to thank the Georgetown Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and the Department of Government for the generous sponsorship for the speaker series. Today, we have great pleasure to invite Professor Changdong Zhang to talk about his book, which is a very insightful one on China's taxation system called Governing and Ruling, the Political Logic of Taxation in China, which was published by University of Michigan Press in 2021. Changdong Zhang is a professor and also chair of Department of Political Science at School of Government at Peking University. He received his PhD in political science from University of Washington, Seattle. And Professor Zhang's research interests include taxation politics, physical sociology, state and society relations, and institutionalism. And he also published widely and have great insights in the Chinese political economy issues. Today, Professor Zhang will speak about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. Please hold your substantive questions to the Q&A session unless you have a clarification question in the middle. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Zhang, and also the floor is yours. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Li Zhi, and thank you, Nin, for your kindly invitation. It's a great pleasure to share my book, which actually now I think is not a new book, but kind of like an older book because it's been published for then more than 2 years. I'm still working on some issues related to the book. And I also share some of my new thoughts on the ongoing research. But now let's just open the slides. Okay, so the book, as Li Zhi just mentioned, is titled as Governing and Ruling. I probably planned to use a subtitle like Taxation and Authoritarian Resilience until the last minute. And then some of my colleagues told me, are you serious? Do you really want to use this as your subtitle? And then I decided to change it to the current subtitle to make sure that it can go through censorship easier back in China. Okay, so here's the table of the contents. So in the introduction in the chapter 1, I propose the theory of physical sociology of authoritarian resilience. And then in chapter 2, I introduce the background, which I call as the tax state transition associated with market transition. Chapter 3 and chapter 4 use some kind of like comparative case studies to discuss how market transition, tax state transition influence the process of bureaucratization in different counties and the regional variations. Chapter 5 examines the legislature or the local people's congress and how this is related to governance quality as well as cooptation of the private entrepreneurs. Chapter 6 discuss about the kind of like the dark side or the negative side of the taxation system and how it weakens the representation mechanism. And chapter 7 draws a conclusion. Okay, so the overall research question is actually like is very familiar one, I think, to most political science scholars and students. It's related to authoritarian resilience or democratization. So why some regimes could be sustained while others cannot, or why some countries get democratized while others not, right? And the China case is of special interest given that China has experienced a rapid market transition as well as the tech state transition, and kind of like 4 decades of very, very rapid economic growth. So this is kind of like a unique case to test the theory of democratization and authoritarian resilience, and possibly to develop some new theory. So before we move on, it's important to define what regime resilience is or what authoritarian resilience is, right? So resilience differs from regime survival because it's not only about maintaining power, stay in power. It's also about thrive and adapt while fostering economic growth and increasing national military power and remain unchallenged. So it's kind of like much more difficult to achieve. And in Chinese, for many years, we call this as like a long-term long-term good governance and stability. And the party also uses this as like one of its kind of like a policy goal. In other words, if we put it in other words, it's kind of like a ruler needed to be loved as well as be feared, right? Using Machiavelli's terminology. So be loved means you should govern the country well, and be feared means you should rule well, right? So the rulers face both the challenge of governing and ruling. So I kind of like get some inspirations from this book, like ruling but not governing. So I think so in China, or at least in the last 4 decades, the CCP was very good in both governing and ruling. The situation maybe is changing recently, but that's the governing and ruling part was, I think, what happened in the last 4 decades. And my argument in brief is that the taxation system actually plays a very important role in resolving or alleviating the governance problem and the dilemmas, and therefore contribute to regime resilience. 3 different mechanisms, which I will elaborate in details later. Okay, so the literature. So what are the existing theories try to explain, and what my explanation or my theory can contribute to the existing debate. So I will focus on both the institutional turn of authoritarian resilience and taxation and authoritarian resilience literatures. Okay, so in the last 2 decades, there is an institutional turn of authoritarian resilience. Scholars focus on different kinds of institutions to explain why some regimes could be maintained much longer than others. And this actually contributed to the comparative party literature, especially the democratization literature, or some people call as the transitionology paradigm, by bringing institutions into analysis. So scholars focus on different institutions. So mostly people focus on coercive and security institutions because they are very important, especially important for authoritarian rulers. Because I mean, you can use this as tools of repression, right? So in China, military is called as like a gun, right? The chang guns, and for police and or law and politics commission, is officially regarded as like it's a knife, like 刀把子. So and in Chinese politics, there are also like lots of literature on the judicial system, police, stability maintenance system, and so on. But in the last decade, more scholars focus on cooptation rather than repression. So different kinds of democratic looking institutions like the legislature, party election, like these institutions are regarded as playing very important role in co-optating the elites, I mean the socio-economic elites. So therefore they become the allies of the regime rather than the rivals of the regime. Besides repression and cooptation, scholars also discuss about the selectoral system. So this is especially important for regimes, the communism regime or post-communism regimes. Some scholars focus on authoritarian welfare state as a cooptation of the mass rather than the elites, right? And propaganda, media, internet censorship, like there are also lots of literature on these issues. Okay. Okay, so I mean, all of this research actually bring lots of new wisdom to our understanding. But the question is, all of these institutions demand huge amount of physical revenue, right? So you need money to co-opt, you need money to repress, you need money to do the censorship, and it's extremely expensive for many of these functions. So the question is, where does the money come from, right? And this is actually like a big challenge. And according to one of the party's national leader, I mean, who actually was sentenced, now is in jail, Zhou Yongkang, who was the head of the Commission of Law and Politics, he says that the problems that can be resolved by RMB is problems between the people, not problems between the classes, right? So, but then the question is, how do you get all of this RMB? And also, the institutional term suffers some theoretical weakness. For example, like most importantly is they are based on some kind of like a simple version or naive version of institutional theories, and they suffer some problem of endogenous problem. All these institutions, they can be manipulated, right? So as Dan's later course, all of these institutions, they are like iron cages, but all of these iron cages, they are in the more powerful iron fist. So the ruler, in other words, the ruler can decide whether to change or not to change these institutions when they feel they need it or they don't need it. So therefore, in the book, I tried to kind of like discuss taxation institution and then build an endogenous institutional change theory to discuss how it can contribute authoritarian resilience, or in the long term, maybe weaken the authoritarian regime. And for taxation and regime, there are also huge amount of literature, especially on like the link between taxation and representation. And then the question is, how can taxation helps authoritarian resilience rather than weaken authoritarian regime, right? So there's so when I was writing on the very early draft of the book, or when I was like started revising my dissertation into a book, I found Slater and Fender has this paper discuss 4 very specific mechanisms between taxation and state power or state infrastructure power. So there's a proposed that there are like 4 different mechanisms. I kind of at that time was a little shocked because I found, okay, the theories are there and there's no more space that I can like contribute to this debate. So this is like what the logic goes like. And until I realized that they don't point out that there are 2 kind of like dilemmas or paradoxes. Okay, so before we move to the dilemmas, I just cite some literature here, especially a sentence, a paragraph from by Joseph Schumpeter more than 100 years ago. So this is like one of the most famous paper on physical sociology. So in the paper, he pointed out that public finance is of both importance for causal or as the outcome, right? So while most research focus taxation as the outcome, my research take taxation as the independent variable rather than dependent variable. Okay, so. And Max Weber also has like lots of research done on physical sociology, which I will discuss in more details, but mostly on taxation and bureaucracy. Okay, so I figure out that there are two very important dilemmas for the ruler, especially for authoritarian rulers related to taxation and their regime resilience. So one is the growth dilemma, another is the representation dilemma. So if you want to, for all of the rulers, regardless of their regime types, they face a choice, right? So they, on the one hand, they can try to maximize their tax revenue, or they want to promote economic growth. And as Douglas North famously put it, the state is the solution of the problems. All of the problems, but at the same time, it could be the problem itself, right? So the challenge is how to balance taxation and economic growth, and this could be even more difficult and authoritarian regime because the rulers face much less limitation or constraints compared to a democracy, especially a democracy with constitutional government. So I will look into how the Chinese Communist Party tries to resolve this growth dilemma in the last 4 decades. And what we can get from this figure is that, so here are like 3 different lines. So the dark line is the nominal GDP growth rate. So what we find, and we also get a real GDP growth rate and then the national tax growth rate. And what we find is that before the year of 1994, which actually is the year the tax share reform was implemented, the GDP growth rate, especially both the nominal and the real GDP growth rate, were much higher than the tax growth rate, right? So in other words, the society benefited much more from the economic growth than the government benefited from it. But afterwards, what we find is that the national tax growth rate exceeds both the nominal and real GDP growth rate. In other words, the government and the party started to extract more and more from the society for the economy. And the trend doesn't change until the very recent years when the economy slows down, and then the central government needed to kind of like respond to that by different by those a combination of tax cut policies. Okay, and the second dilemma is on the representation dilemma. So, so if we go back to Michael Mann's definition of the two different state power, the infrastructural power and the despotic power. So what we find is taxation, of course, is regarded the best indicator or for states' infrastructural power. But the dilemma is that when the state penetrates into the society, I mean, for more extraction, the society may also penetrate into the state, right? So this is a taxation and the representation story. So if the government takes more from you, you want to resist, right? Or you want to bargain, you want some power, to vote and to make policies. It happens in many countries. And this is like regarded as a very important reason of democracy. So how can the Communist Party increase its extraction power without losing its despotic power, or without kind of like introduce more democracy. So these are two dilemmas. And to answer the question of why rapidly increasing tax revenue or tax power does not lead to democratization, we needed to able to answer these two dilemmas, or how and why CCP can resolve or at least alleviate these two dilemmas. Yeah, so there's so this representation dilemma is related to this quasi-voluntary compliance theory proposed by Margaret Levy. Right, so the rulers should keep their bargaining, right? So in other words, there are some kind of like representation system or institution is required. So I argue that there are different mechanisms that could resolve these two dilemmas. This is related to the institutional characteristics of Chinese tax state. And there are three very important dimensions of China's tax state. So one is the fiscal federalism. Second is the half tax state, and the third is under institutionalized taxation system. So the first one has been studied very, very extensively, but the second and the third were kind of like understudied. So I put it in this way to illustrate the relationship. So what we can find, so what I'm proposed here is that so the half tax state is good in helping the CCP to strengthen its social control, but it kind of like weakens agent discipline, which means like how they control the local agents or the bureaus and in different regions. And the under institutionalized taxation system also helps social control, but it's bad for agent discipline. But at the same time, it elicits cooperation. And the de facto fiscal federalism is kind of like positive for both agent discipline and illicit cooperation. So it's kind of like a little abstract, and I will elaborate in more details later. So the research design, so because the argument seems a little complicated, so therefore I use a mixed method research design. So I use in-depth case study, which includes both process tracing. So I trace a county for more than 30 years, from the beginning of the reform to a middle 2010s. And I also do some kind of like within case comparison, so which kind of like I divide the case into three stages, historical stages, and to compare like how things been changed in different stages. And then I do some comparative case study by bringing in like more cases, or in other words, like more counties. And I also do some quantitative study to test the hypotheses I draw based on this comparative case study. And I relied on various sources for my data. So I did like about 1 year's field work, and I was very lucky to get access to some archives, the archives of local People's Congress, as well as the local the taxation bureaus in like 2 counties. And I also used some existing survey data and rely heavily on some second-hand data. Okay, so for the comparative case study, there are 2 main cases. One I call the Swan River, which is located in Zhejiang province in East China, and another I call as the Cold Mountain County, which is located in North China, Shanxi province. And they were of the exactly the same level of economic development when I went there for my field work in 2010. And but the economic performance differs like 6 years or 5 or 6 years later, mainly because of the decrease of the coal mining, price of coal mining. And so my independent variable mostly is about asset mobility of the major industry in the county. So whether it's a light industry with high asset mobility or whether it's a low asset mobility industry, and then it kind of like can explain for the differences of the governance quality. And I also have some kind of like complementary cases, which given the time and financial constraint, I could not go there and stay for like more than 1 month or two to collect more data. But it's kind of like these cases were able to they are able to kind of like provide some premier testing and also enrich my empirical evidence to develop my hypothesis. Okay, so now I'm moving to the governing part, right? So it's governing and the ruling. So this is the governing part, and with a focus on how the fiscal federalism contribute to the process of bureaucratization. Right, so as I just mentioned, I kind of like divided the history into different stages, but here just it's kind of like I divided the history of People's Republic of China into like 3 stages based on its market transition and the tech state transition. So before the reform, China had a planned economy. So the economic system is like, but is like an underdeveloped planned economy. So compared to Soviet Union and many Eastern European communist country, the Chinese planned economy was kind of like of underdeveloped because the level of industrialization was kind of like lagged off, and therefore China is regarded as has this like M economy compared to like U economy in Soviet Union. It's highly decentralized. So the type of tech state at that time could be called as a communist state, right? Basically, the state or the government relied very heavily not on tax revenue, but on profit, SOE, I mean state-owned enterprise profit remittance. So we call this like unitary remittance and unitary expenditure system. So it's like in Chinese, it's 统收统支. So the local government has had very limited, if not no, autonomy in their fiscal power. And then with the reform, or I think Professor Jing Oi, as Li advisor, would argue that the physical decentralization actually kind of like initiated the local government's economic reform, right? So we had this fiscal contracting system, and it's related. It's led to partially liberalized market, very rapid development of TVEs. But what I add to this literature is that why this fiscal decentralization has very positive effect on economic development. It had some very negative effect on the bureaucratic system, or people may call, some people even call this is like a process of re-feudalization. In other words, the local governments in different levels, they got too much power, right? And they kind of like got too much autonomy from their supervisors. The practice is related to different kind of tax farming. I mean, they are modern tax farming. The local governments, they become the tax farmers. And there's like very rampant extra budgetary funding. So the government, they are not like as government, right? So they are like corporations. The bureaucratic system was kind of like, I mean, not destroyed, but they were degenerated. And the third stage is also marked by the tax share system or the tax share reform in 1994. And at the same time, or the Chinese Communist Party claimed that or proposed that they will have some comprehensive reform to build a socialist market economy, right? So, and related to that is the tax share reform. The Chinese government kind of like become to rely more and more on tax revenue, but at the same time also some non-tax revenue. And they were very effective in monitoring all of this extra budgetary fund. Okay, so if we put our analysis under this very macro historical background, we will find that so China had a planned economy, SOEs, no taxation at that time, and then under the fiscal contracting system, the Chinese government relied more and more on tax and non-tax revenue. With this feudalization of the bureaucracy, and there was limited regional competition, economic competition. And then from in the last 30 years, under the tax share system, there was the process of privatization, rising regional competition. And the local governments, they were forced to compete with each other by improving their environmental business environmental, right? And very, very important for that, or a key component of that is the process of re-bureaucratization. So to constrain the bureaucracy's power, ask to then to serve the interest of investment requirement rather than run enterprises by themselves. So Yuan Yuan'an in her first book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, also discusses a similar question, but I also try to add some new insights into this story. And with a focus on taxation. So here, Jiang Zemin, like after his retirement, it's kind of like 1 year after his retirement, he had this speech, and you guys even can find this on YouTube. So he visited like one state-owned enterprises, which he actually served as the CEO and the party secretary for years before he went to the government. And he said, okay, so one of his achievement during his like more than 10 years presidential, he kind of like cut off the business from the military. Right, and he says, okay, this is really, really important for building a modern military. And this cutting the business from local government is also very, very important for Chinese bureaucracy or the process of bureaucratization. And this actually is a document issued by a province government, the Heilongjiang province government, asking their the government leaders to read two journalist reports on improving the business environment in northeastern China, and it's mostly related to predatory government, kind of like so the government branches are so predatory that no business want to make investment in northeast China, right? So the province governor says, okay, you guys should read this carefully and do something effectively to improve your business environment. So based on Max Weber's theory of bureaucracy, I kind of like put the China case into these three different stages as I just discussed, with a focus on the physical dimension. So of course Weber has different. I mean, he listed like about like 10 different characteristics of a modern bureaucracy and how it differs from like the older patterns of domination, right? So and Yuan Yuan's book, first book, actually more focused more on this like functional differentiation. So for me, like I focus on the physical dimension of that. So like Max Weber argues that one of the key point for building a modern bureaucracy is that the separation of public benefits from private benefits from the public position or the means of officialdom. So it's kind of like so, and this is understudied in many literature. So here, like from the perspective of taxation, I try to kind of like figure out how CCP or how the Chinese government kind of like rebuild its bureaucracy system. I mean, especially in the local level, by separating the government from the business and paying the government officers with salaries rather than allowing them to run the business directly and take the profits from the business rather than like so it's kind of like a process of re-bureaucratization. So under the planned economy, and as I just mentioned, it's the unitary remittance and the unitary expenditure system. The revenue was very limited, but the bureaucracies or the bureaucrats or the government officials, they were paid by the government, right? So they had no other income source besides their salary. But then under the fiscal contracting system, or what I call this feudalization process period, the local government and local government bureaus, local government bureaucrats, they became tax farmers, and government salary was their not their major income source. Their major income source was actually from their extra budgetary fund. So the local government and the many government branches, they were profit oriented rather than public service oriented. But the good news is that because it promote economic growth, so what we find is it is associated with rapidly increasing fiscal revenue, right? So after the tax share reform in middle 1990s, there's like a modern bureaucracy being rebuilt. There's most tightened budgetary management, and the government is kind of like restructured or remodeled to provide public service rather than to make profit by themselves. So given the time limitation, I'm not going to discuss other dimensions because my research mostly focus on this dimension. So I was very lucky to get access of the local People's Congress archives in a county in Zhejiang province. So I was able to tracing like what happened like in the 1980s, 1990s, and later on. And I find that so in different time period. So at the beginning, it was an agricultural county, very, very poor. And I mean, of course, agriculture is of very low asset mobility. At that time, the government strategy, I mean, we are very, very, so we are very, very familiar with this story. I think Professor Jing Oi and many other scholars like have like this theorized this historical period very well, right? So the government strategy is running TVEs, and to make sure their TVEs are making profit, they monopolize the market by setting market barriers for enterprises from other regions. At that time, the private entrepreneurs or the capitalists, they have limited or medium bargaining power. And the bureaucracy associated with that, if we using Max Weber's terminology, it's about patrimonialism, right? It's predatory government. And then with more and more TVs and private enterprises, the asset mobility become higher and higher. And then after the tax share reform, most SOEs and collected TVs got privatized. Therefore, the asset mobility became very, very high at the end of 1990s and 2000s. The local government realized that they must change their strategy of economic development. They cannot rely on running TVs because, I mean, the TVs actually got bankrupt. So they find it's very important to keep the capital within their jurisdiction, right? So making sure the private enterprises will stay here, and at the same time, they also want to invite outside investment, like known as this investment recruitment. Well, how can do that? How can they do that? They need to actually improve their business environment, right? So they what do they find? The biggest challenge is about the predatory bureaucrats, right? So they needed to constrain the power of the bureaucrats. So they took lots of efforts to constrain the power of the bureaucrats, and then there's like the emergence of modern bureaucracy. But later on, I find out that after the middle 2000s, especially in the last 1.5 decade, the rise of real estate industry, I mean, or the housing industry actually brings something negative, because as you can imagine, the real estate industry has kind of like low asset mobility, and there's like lots of government business collusion between real estate developers and the government. So therefore, there's some kind of like degeneration of modern bureaucracy. But the good news is that because the land industry keeps on growing, so the land actually brings huge amount of revenue to local government. So only part of the bureaucracy that are related to this industry suffers this negative effect. So based on that, I tried to revise Yuan Yuan's co-evolution model of market and bureaucracy, as I just mentioned, by add this taxation or physical dimension into analysis. So I would argue that, okay, physical industrialization is very, very important, as many others have argued, but I kind of like bring this negative side of the story into analysis of this like a refeudalization into analysis. And but I mean, as others would argue, this I mean led to economic growth, regardless of the predatory government. I mean, mostly because China was so poor at that time, and then under the tax share reform, and then privatization of SOEs and the TVs, there's rising asset mobility. So forced the local government leaders to improve business environment, mostly through a process of bureaucratization. And then the market was further developed. So there's like a mutual transformation of market and bureaucracy system. So based on this historical process tracing, I also added some comparative case studies, as I just mentioned, as another case and another 5 complementary cases to develop the hypothesis. And I figured out that asset mobility could be very, very important. But I added that asset mobility is not simply a physical nature, right? It's more about institutional determined, and it's related to this physical system. So I built like this hypothesis based on asset mobility and governance quality, and I use quantitative data to test both qualitative, and quantitative analysis to test the hypothesis. So here, like what we can find, like asset mobility really matters. So I don't put the regulational table in the slides, but you can find it in the book. I also discussed the theoretical implications of these findings, and with the theoretical, especially borrowing some insights from the theories of mutual transformation between state and society. And then, like for the literature for China's political economy, I also kind of like to discuss how my theory can contribute to the recent debate. Okay, that's the physical federalism side. And now let's move to the half-tech state. Okay, so I may need like about 10 minutes to finish it. So I call the China's tech state as a half-tech state because it differs from this like full tech state like in the United States or other countries. So mostly because Chinese government relies very heavily on indirect taxes rather than direct taxes. So the United States relies very heavily on direct taxes, especially on personal income tax, right? So, but in China, mostly it's about the personal income tax only contributes to about 7% of tax revenue. The SOEs are very important source for tax revenue. They paid about 1/3 of the tax revenue. And there are many non-tax revenue, including social security fund. So in China, social security is not tax, but a government fee. And the land-related revenue, as well as many fees and fines. So in this year, it is reported that many of the highway and even not as high speed way, like they restarted charging fees. Which the government had abolished for more than 10 years. Because of all of this physical pressure. So this is the art of planting the goose, right? So about how to tax more revenue. And this actually has very important implications for citizens' perception about the government, about their tax burdens, right? So what we find is that huge like very high percentage of people, they have no perception about their tax burden, and many of them think their tax burden is fair, right? Very few people think, only like less than 7% of people think they pay too much taxes compared to their peers and compared to the public service they received. So this is like less than 10% of people think they pay too much taxes compared to the public service they received. And this is, of course, good for the rulers, right? Because people are not complaining they are paying too much taxes. So it's good for the government because they have higher state autonomy. But it could be bad for economic development because relying too much on SOEs or land and the real estate industry is leading to inefficiency, inequality, and lots of corruption, right? So, and I think in the last 2 or 3 years, or right after the book is published, we witness more of this negative effects. So I worked with Professor Bruce Dickinson at George Washington University, and we published this paper, The Art of Plucking the Goose, discussing how this half-tech state contributes to Chinese urban residents' very low tax consciousness. So if you are interested, you can find it. Okay, so the third part, so the third empirical part, I mean, which Professor Len thinks as like kind of like a very negative part of the system, is this under-institutionalized tax administration. So, and I think this is very, very key for why a transition to tax state does not lead to democracy in China, or how it resolves this representation dilemma in China. Right. So on one hand, we find that there are more and more private entrepreneurs. They are entering local people's congress, local people's political consultant conference, the Minzhenxie, and even in some regions, even the local party committee. I mean, so it seems like there is a representation through taxation mechanism, right? If you pay more taxes, you are more likely to be like a People's Congress deputy, or like even like be a party committee member. And some of my informants even said that the local People's Congress and the LPPCC, they are club of the powerful and the rich. So the powerful actually is the officials, the rich is the private entrepreneurs. So so there is like a link between paying taxes and being representatives, right? So so Professor Yue Hou published the book on the private sector in public office, and she finds that the private entrepreneurs, they become LPC deputies or National People's Congress deputies to protect their property rights. That's true, of course, but what we find is that they become a LPC deputy, rather try to build the same kind of patron-clientelism relationship rather than being cooptated, or not to mention to represent the interests of their constituents. So if you examine what they do, and especially if you examine how they get elected into the LPC, you find that, okay, it's not a story of representation, it's a story about building patron-clientelism. And then what are their motivations? Securing property rights, of course, is very important, but and it is related to taxation and predatory taxation practices. So I examine the tax administration, and I find this is a highly under-institutionalized system. First, it's the taxation system sets the nominal tax rates very, very high. In other words, if you don't evade taxes, legally or illegally, it's really difficult to make profits. And this is especially true for the private enterprises, which has very low marginal tax profit rates. And one of my informant who actually worked in the taxation bureau for like about 30 years, when I conducted my interview in 2010, frankly told me that there was only one enterprise in his career that he could not find any evidence of tax evasion. All others, I mean, including SOEs, I mean, state-owned enterprises, they are evading taxes, much or less. So this leaves the tax officers with very high discretional power. Even, I mean, in nowadays, even the bureaucracy system has improved their technology, especially this informational technologies. It's still like a big problem. At the same time, the Chinese government has this tax targeting system, tax target system. So it means like the central government will set a tax target, like how many taxes you should collect this year. And then the province level, prefecture level, county level, they will also set the targets. Okay, so in other words, the tax bureaus, they collect tax according to the target set by their supervisors, rather than according to the taxpayers' tax liabilities, right? So it's kind of like, I mean, in good years, when the economy grows quickly, it's an easy task but when the economy slows down, the business will suffer, right? So it's kind of like it's not a rule of law or even not a rule by law system. And how it has very important implications for the private entrepreneurs. On one hand, they needed to evade tax, but there's very rampant tax evasion, and there is selective implementation or selective enforcement, right? So they allow all of this tax evasion, and they only target those very few people. And I call this as kind of like legal repression. And mostly because if you are politically, you are a lawyer, and you have all of the good connections with specific government officers, you are fine, even if you are evading taxes. But if you get a better connection, a better relationship with officers, or especially if you kind of like show some disloyalty, right? So one very famous example is a very famous artist, Ai Weiwei. So Ai Weiwei is like a internationally famous artist, and also like a very famous political dissent. And then one year, like he was unable to go abroad. He was stopped in the airport and then lost his freedom. And then when like there's like many, even including like Wall Street Journal, kind of like criticize the Chinese government for how they treated the political dissidents. It was an officer from the taxation bureau who says, "Oh, this guy is a criminal because he evaded so much taxes," and they have all of the evidence to do that, right? So it's kind of like a legal repression. Of course, like many Chinese capitalists, they are criminals. If we have very strict standard on tax enforcement, so this kind of like there's like institutionally generated fear, right? So everybody is fear about being punished because they are criminals, right? So therefore, they want to build all of this patronage rather than challenge the party state. So this is Machiavelli's very famous paragraph, right? It's difficult for a ruler to be feared and be loved at the same time. So it's better to be feared rather than be loved. And theoretically, I think it's kind of like the legal repression could kind of like there are two sort mechanisms. One is there is a cooptation via privilege, right? So if you work with the party state, then you get some privileges. But it is also a cooptation via deterrence mechanism. So if you doesn't show you loyalty, then they will deter you, right? So it's kind of like, therefore you need they achieve cooperation and compliance at the same time. Okay, now after these three parts of empirical analysis, let's try to finish it by some quick conclusion. Okay, so there are like three different mechanisms, but by building these mechanisms, I try to build an endogenous institutional explanation of authoritarian resilience. And I also, instead of focusing on state capacity, I think state power could be more important. And so an exogenous institutional explanation would go like this: taxation institution solves some kind of these dilemmas and then help for CCP's rule. But if what we find is CCP actually kind of like revise or reformed the taxation system several times, right? So because there are these like quasi parameters on economic growth, on this like feudalization or refeudalization. These positive and negative effects, and then the central committee responded to all of these consequences, positive and negative, and then they revise the system, and then the system helps to so it's kind of like there's some kind of like endogeneity of this institution. And I also tried to compare this legal repression with rightful resistance and for billions. Given the time limits, I'm not going to go to the details. And I also compare China, do some historical comparison, compare current contemporary China with the Qing dynasty or the Ming dynasty to see the similarities and the differences, and also do some like comparative comparison with other post-communist countries and the developing countries. Okay, so that's all about my presentation. So thank you for your attention.